Good morning to one and all present here. A warm welcome to all the panelists, guests, and students. Thank you for taking time out to attend the Bespoke Show. Bespoke Show is defined as something that is custom made. The Bespoke is an initiative conceptualized to live up to this dictionary definition. It is neither another Me Too inspirational talk, nor it is a platform to share larger than life personal stories. Bespoke is a forum for candid discussion on topics of interest covering conventional and non-conventional sectors, mainstream and offbeat careers, art and literature, media and entertainment, and even international affairs. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today's host, Ms. Asha Sampath and Sid Baliga. Asha Sampath is the founder director of Brand Horizon, a brand management and consulting based in Bangalore. She is the former managing director of Indeka Ceramics Limited. Ms. Asha is an independent director on the board of Toyota Financial Services India Limited and is a part of advisory council for EFI. Mr. Sid Baliga is an educationist by profession and an author by passion. He has published in Times of India, the Assam of Tribute, Northeast highest circulated English diary, and the periodicals of the ICFAI University Press. Deccan Herald quoted Mr. Sid for his expertise in international SOP and resume development. He advocates fundamental rights and has crowdfunded a campaign titled Bihar Ki Beti Twice on Milap, first in 2017 for a 5-year-old child from Begusarai, Bihar, and second in 2019 for a victim of human trafficking from Bihar. Today's discussion is on product leadership in a data-driven world, wherein we hear 3 perspectives from 3 business leaders with years of expertise in product development. We have with us Ramakant Das, Director, AI Solution, NASSCOM Center of Excellence, Internet of Things. Sir, I kindly request you to grace the dais. I kindly request Ms. Asha and Ms. Sid Baliga to grace the dais. An alumnus of NIT Rourkela and ISB Hyderabad, Ramakant is a former regional director, Mindtree Limited. Mr. Das has over 17 years of experience in the enterprise services and consulting industries. He has had a global consulting experience, having collaborated with enterprises across the world from USA, UK, Australia, Singapore, Dubai, and India region. Since the past decade and a half, he has been very successful in creating and consulting new age solutions for enterprises across the data and SMAC solutions portfolio. I request our Dean, Dr. Veena, to welcome Mr. Das. We have with us Vidya Veera Raghavan, Head of Analytics, Financial Market Operation, Standard Chartered Bank. Madam, I request you to kindly be seated on the dais. Vidya was formerly with Citibank. She is a certified business analytic professional having 17 years of experience in banking and information technology operations, enabling data-driven decisions and solutions demonstrating strong leadership, communication, and analytical skills. I request our HOD, Professor Nikita, to welcome Ms. Vidya. And now we have Liddick Xavier, Head of Products, Data Science Technologies. Sir, I kindly request you to grace the dais. An alumnus of SP Jain, Mr. Xavier was formerly Vice President at Texila American University and Associate Director at Simply Learn. Mr. Xavier has had 10 plus years of experience in product management, analytics and marketing. He's worked with Fortune 500 companies like Dell, Verizon and also played a key role in the growth of startups such as Lending Card. I request Professor Chrissy Matthew to welcome Mr. Xavier.
Thank you. Good morning to all the panelists and good morning to all the audience. Before we get into discussions of product leadership and what defines product leadership and how the product is designed and developed and marketed, let us first understand or differentiate between the old conventional product and the modern product. So when we think of a product, what comes into our mind even today is about a product which is manufactured and then somebody marketing it, communicating about it and trying to sell it to someone. So there's a tangible product which we can see, feel and then take it to the market. But in modern times, we have products which are purely based on data points. So typical examples could be Ola or Zomato, which purely works on aggregation of let's say hoteliers, aggregation of delivery boys or aggregation of let's say in case of taxis, aggregation of driver partners and maybe customers who are booking the cabs. So there is no tangible product, but yet we call it a product and we define leadership. Media, if you look at media, it is also evolving in terms of media consumption, personalized content. So now if I want to draw a parallel, taking this question a little more focused towards banking, since we have Vidya on board on the panel, we have a lot of data points that get generated in banking, the usage of debit cards, usage of payments, credit cards, and so many products so many instruments, financial instruments that customers use. So how is banking going to evolve in the coming years, just like media or just like say, any other segment, to make it more personalized? So do I see a personalized financial product as compared to a generalized loan product or any other savings bank or CASA accounts that we have? Do we foresee such products coming up in banking?
Good morning all. Rightly put, data points, a lot of people call it data as a new oil, it's the new oxygen, a variety of words used. The bottom line is that data is definitely the source of everything, including the banking products. And since banking is more to do with service industry, I should say once you collect the data, then you start servicing your customers better. So banks are all about wowing the customer, retaining them, and also adding new books that we call when you add new customers to the bank. So I can quote two examples where data have really pioneered the further product or service that we call. Amex, American Express, everybody knows, and recently in India they have been sourcing new clients pretty much. So Amex has this app which gives personalized based on the location where you are. It connects the GPS and also understand where you are, and it connects with the merchants with which it deals with. So immediate offers which are available in the place where you are. A typical example is when you're in a big shopping mall, Amex has few merchants who are running some campaign or some offers. If Amex understands that you are also part of the same building, so it immediately throws up an offer or a prompt, an alert to your mobile phone through the app. DBS, there are many banks who run with the propensity base that we call, based on the requirements, based on the offers which are running. They pick up the right clients to approach, because all the marketing and the efforts that we are putting in, they are money and time. So in order to save all these things, DBS had come up with this insurance clients specific to their needs, their age group, their location, what stage of their career they are in, and bring in a specific, only specific to that particular client, what is the good product to sell. So when relationship managers are armed with such an important decision to make, when they go to the client does see the value for personal value. So that's how the data are, evolving. I should say it's already started the journey quite a bit, and there's a lot more area to cover. So we are just heading there.
So which means that we can hope to see personalized offers, you're saying. That's what I understand.
Definitely, because I know what my client is going through. I know his or her credit card, debit card transactions, the foreign exchange transactions, and also what kind of business, because KYC is a mandatory for all the business, so what kind of business a client is into, how I can modify or specifically give that particular product, which is very, very specific to that client, which is of good use at that point in time, right place, and the right product. Absolutely. It's called micro-segmenting also, because if I see one client who is in the same scenario, same age group, same salary bracket, and also living in the same location, also in the same career stage, I can probably create a product so that I can concentrate on those three clients, which can be, the tailor-made product for those three clients, which will be an immediately hit. You will have a 100% hit rate, rather than, I can give you something, or I can have a platter of data-driven or products, and I ask you to choose. Rather than that, I tell you that this is the right because of so and so reason, and my data and the statistics shows this. So that's a more convincing way of telling the client that, see, this product is rightly made for you, please pick it up.
Good morning, everybody, also to the audience. I'd like to start with Ramakant. We are blessed to be in an era of Industry 4.0, right? And where we have a lot of cutting-edge technologies like AI, ML, IoT, blockchain. All of these are helping us to collect data every day in abundance. So we are really pounded with data, both collected from humans and from machines. I was reading about a statistics that IBM says every day we collect 2.5 exabytes of data. And I was also reading a statistic from NASSCOM that the data science sector is going to be something like $16 billion by 2025. My question is, what's your perspective of how the data science as a product leadership tool has evolved over the years, and where do you see that going? Question one. And I'm also wondering, to what extent the gut or the intuition that used to make people as product leaders in the past, is that still relevant, or is data wiping out the concept of gut and intuition?
Let me answer this question giving two examples. Hello. Yeah. So let me answer this question. Hello. Yeah. So thank you for the question. So let me give you two examples. So one, there's a large, so yesterday I met a founder of a large, of a 40-year-old enterprise here in Bangalore. So I'm not sure, it's called Confident Dental. So they are essentially manufacturers of these dental chairs that you see in clinics, right? And it's a 45-year-old organization, and the founder, Mr. Rakshit Sethi. So he was mentioning that, so he recently implemented a blockchain solution. And they sell these chairs across the country. And what that blockchain solution, they have recently, and as part of that solution, what he was mentioning that they get a lot of these claims from his buyers. And the claims are related to components of the chairs.
And also he doesn't know where the chairs go, who are the actual buyers. So what he was, and his statement was this, and it was really nice, that one of these chairs cost similar to a mini-sized car, right? And he says that if cars can offer a experience zone, why not I? And that is one. And second statement he said was, he fulfills the claims as they come, irrespective of where they're coming from, whether assessing on the genuinity part. Now with this blockchain solution, it gives him accurate transferability as to where the product has gone and from where the claim is coming. So he now knows whether the claim that he is fulfilling and supplying to is genuine or not. So that means more accurate. So that means more profits or more. He has been able to stop all pilferage, rather, of his customer servicing. So 2-3 aspects come out of this case study, right? So one is he's able to exactly know who are his customers. He can align all his sales and marketing towards that. And second, he wants to create that with the advanced knowledge of where his customers are and who are the customers. The next generation of product features will be oriented towards his actual customer needs, rather than hearsay and all that. So this is a classic example of what he was doing by gut feeling and talking and knowing from people, and he's replaced with the data, right? So he again, I'll quote one more data point. He said there were like from Bidadi, he used to receive like 20-25 claims every month, which was which was wrong, which was fraudulent claims.
False claims.
Yeah, but then he had no other option because he didn't know whether the buyer was a genuine or not. With this, all that is stopped. So the gut feeling and the assumption and all has been replaced with data back, right?
So both the product leaders and the customers are benefiting immensely from this new technology.
Yes, and and of course we hear. I mean, with NASSCOM, I was just telling Lamas that in last 6 or 7 months with NASSCOM, I have personally myself spoken to around 1,000 entrepreneurs, right? And we day in and out we come across new technologies, be it AI, deep tech, and all of that. All these technologies are fairly simple in concept, right? So IBM quotes that all large organizations they generate so much of data, but we don't need all the whole data to actually act. Rather, the right data is more important. And so the right data at the right time, and which is actionable data, that is more important.
That's interesting, because a lot of times excessive data can lead to misleading results, right?
Absolutely.
Sometimes even the best data scientists get them wrong.
Right.
So I think trying to decode what is relevant and harness on that to drive enterprises towards data-driven products
Right.
is a
So
challenge.
one of the key components of any data, especially in large enterprises, is a data lake itself. So data lake is a amalgamation of all data generators and producers and consumers in a large enterprise. So much of the, let's say, the chief data officers or the CIOs, one of the biggest goals or challenges is to ensure that the data lake that gets created doesn't have the noise within it, or gets the right pool of data from its producers, and the right consumers take it at in the most accessible manner.
Ramakant, just taking your example forward, you pointed towards maybe a little bit of marginal innovation in the example, and now comparing this, let's say, is this a precursor to product leadership, or operational excellence is what is required? I'll just give you an example. Look at McDonald's, which has absolutely no innovation happening at all, but it runs purely on operational excellence.
Right.
So do you think innovation is a precursor always to product leadership?
Right. So product leadership, if you see, so I'll just break down I'll flip your question. Product leadership is has two factors. One is operational excellence, and second is customer intimacy, right? So if there is operational excellence and customer excellency, you have product leadership. So McDonald's, the core selling point or the sustainable point of McDonald's is the operational excellence. I agree to that. But then there is also a customer intimacy part. There are genuine fans of McDonald's driving in and day out. I mean, McDonald's of course is not an India brand, but the brand from where it is coming from, like from US, there are genuine fans going in, out of the stores and coming out, right? And I can give a more relevant, like let's say India example. Let's say our traditional food chains that we have, MTRs. Customer intimacy is a great factor, and there's also operational excellence.
So that's part of operational
great
excellence.
Product that is.
That's part of operational excellence rather than product innovation.
No, yeah, there's no product innovation. There's customer intimacy.
Customer intimacy. Right.
The same people know each other.
Okay, personalized.
Yes. They know intimately their customers.
Right.
I might add something to this.
Sure.
I understand the operation excellence. I also understand the product leadership. Definitely customers intimacy, what Ramakant mentioned, is a part of both these. But there's a time and place for everything. I can quote South India's famous example of Saravana stores. It's very popular chain of buildings with a lot of wholesale products attracting the masses. It's just operation excellence for them. Cheap price, cheap everything, and then you attract the mass. But the same cannot happen with Tesla, right? Tesla is a very unique product made to only a specific area or a segment of people. Rather than, it comes with a product leadership in itself. When it comes to the part of customer, they have segregated. So basically, when you achieve operation excellence, there also you specifically target a particular segment of clients. Like Saravana stores used to target the masses, I should say the lower middle class or below that. And Tesla definitely on the high-end circle. So it's only the difference between what the client needs rather than, how am I going to market it, or how am I have produced a product, I just want to market it. No, that's not the case. Here, they have picked up the product. Before even picking up the product, they have picked up the segment of the clients to whom they have to go to. So product is basically defined by the client segment also. That's another point.
Mass and class.
Mass and class. Right? So it has to be specific to clients. When you start a product or when you start a product life cycle, you should think about whom are you going to target. Are you going to target, say for example, I can quote Citi's example. Citi has gold customers, beyond the private bankers, and also the Suvidha customers who are the corporate salaried people. So if I'm producing a product, basically before checking this out, I should have analyzed the market, and the market tells me that I have thousands of companies who have lakhs of employees who would require a zero balance account, which is clear cut, but they will definitely have a lot of churn in that. Again, if I'm looking at the specific client base, which is at the top class, I will have to have some kind of differentiation there. So when I choose my client, and also based on that, I choose my product to create. So that's how it is differentiated.
I think you touched upon the right point. Now, how do we classify Tata Nano? What was the reason behind Tata Nano's failure, if I can call it a failure?
Okay, Tata Nano was or is a very good product. It's a very attractive product. Definitely a lot of people wanted it. At least when the initial marketing started, they definitely wanted it. But the only problem that I see with which it probably failed is that the word that they use, cheap. They use the word cheap in their marketing because car in itself in India is a social status. So if I have a car, which means I am above the normal day-to-day bread earning scenario. So if I am going to have a cheap car, what's the point? I am still the same. People will still think that my social status has not increased. Why should I even go for a car? Rather than that, I might probably push little more and take a Beat or I-10, or at that point in time, whichever small car was in presence. But Tata Nano product in itself was a very good car. In fact, my sister owns a car, but it has become a second car for her, not a first car. It is more of the utility that we saw and we bought the car rather than taking that as a social prestige. That I think that was the market placing where they use the word cheap, the cheapest car, the utility car, made it sound like it's not worth it. That's probably one of the reasons why Tata Nano did not kick in.
Okay.
I guess it did not align with the social positioning that they wanted to relate to, right? Yeah. Your question or?
So my line is more about education. So since you got a background in education space, there is a fancy term that is used, EdTech, education technology. Okay, and we have companies like Vedantu, and we have Byju's, and we have Simply Learn, which have made a big name in the market. In fact, something like Vedantu, we had Tutor Vista, which was an early mover long back. But if you look at the innovation part, I think it's only the platform that has changed over the years in terms of content delivery rather than the product by itself. So what do you think is the reason for success of these brands? And also, do you think there is some disruption that's going to happen in this space in future?
Okay, so I think Simply Learn, Tutor, these are probably different spaces, even though they are into online education. Simply Learn caters more to professional education. They don't look at school students or college students. They are primarily into training and corporate employees, right? They are primarily into educating employees on PMP, project management, and such short-term courses, right? And Simply Learn's business is probably they are probably really big in US. Even though they are very popular in India, their US business is a major component of their whole piece. And for somebody like Vedantu, they are all focusing on the Indian market. So this is a key difference between Simply Learn and Vedantu and Tutor Vista. Somebody like a Tutor Vista was also focusing on other markets like UAE and US and UK as well. But primarily they were into school education, right? Earlier when initially it was started, when the when Simply Learn or similar companies started, what they did was they were primarily targeting two modes of education, two modes of delivering the programs, right? One was through a packaged program, a canned program, let's say for PMP or Prince 2 or whatever you want to learn. They will have a recorded program, and this program will be delivered whenever you want at your convenience, right? So the disadvantage is like if you have a query, you may not be able to ask somebody, right? Because you don't have a tutor who is teaching you, right? The second mode was they were organizing classroom trainings. Let us say there are 20 people who are interested in a training in New York. They will arrange a training in New York for those 20 people. Now, later on, they figured out that both these models were not really, in one case, students are not able to get their questions clarified. The other model is very expensive, right? If you have to, get a center venue in a city like New York, for 20 students, it's going to be very expensive. If it is going to be expensive, you're going to charge as much to your participants as well, right? So then they came up with this virtual mode of training, right, where you deliver lectures through a system and it was actually even more efficient because you can actually have your trainers sitting in India, because they are going to be less expensive, and you can have participants sitting across the globe. They need not be just from New York. They can be sitting in Australia. They can be sitting in US. They can be sitting in UK. Right? So this is a model that a lot of companies today are adopting, right? And so this model is still it still works where people are willing to pay a premium for the trainer interaction, right? So if you look at there are like new age startups, like you have Udemy, you have MOOCs, massive online programs. So on these kind of programs, there are canned programs. You have like I don't know how many of you have used Udemy as of now, right? In Udemy, it is like a marketplace for education. It is not a Simply Learn who has one trainer. He says this is the only trainer who's going to train you. You have like hundreds of trainers on Udemy who have built their own custom programs. Let us say you are great at teaching something, right? You build your own program, you put it on Udemy, and after a while there are people who are giving you your program feedback.
Many of these are pre-recorded lectures actually.
Yeah, most of these are pre-recorded lectures, but it is very successful because once your effort is very limited, right? The trainer's effort is very limited. He records the program once and for all, and after that he forgets. So all the money he gets after that is profit for him. So I think it works really well. I think this is a model which is going to work really well in future as well. The massive online, open online courses, because it basically is a win-win-win for all the three parties.
But the dropout rates are also huge in such programs because the courses are very cheap. So the stickiness is very less.
Yeah,
so you
that
get
is a-
$10 programs, $20 programs on Udemy.
Yeah, that is a very valid point. If you see the dropout rates, whenever I've seen for most of these package programs, they are as high as 70-80%. So which is a genuine problem, but yeah, who should be worried? Like, if I'm going to spend 1,000 rupees to take a program, right, I should be able to leverage that program. If I'm not doing that, then it is my loss.
Great. So just adding to this, there was a company called thinkvidya.com which
Yeah.
pivoted to become something else, I think Urban Pro.
Right.
Yeah, so they wanted to become the Uber of that space. So they have been pivoting a lot. So what do you think? I mean, is there a space for such a product in the education segment, first of all?
I think they have been pivoting into a very relevant areas. I think they have probably they have not gone into professional education even till now. I think initially they were only into school education. I think now they have gone into entrance exams and things like that, which I see is more of a vertical integration, right? Somebody does schooling, then he goes for IIT preparations and things like that. Then he goes for IAS and things like. I think it's more of a vertical integration. So as long as they don't go for a very an area that is not relevant to them. Let's say they don't go into something like what HouseJoy is doing, right? I don't see a problem with that. I don't know how their internal numbers are working.
Okay.
But to me, it looks like a very relevant diversification.
So I think that's a good move you're saying. Great.
It has basically added a few more courses to it. Earlier, like he rightly mentioned, it was education pure and pure. Earlier, it was connecting the tutors and the students on a day-to-day education basis, like a CBSE course for class 10 or class 9. Later, they moved on to the hobby classes area, which is quite relevant as well, because when you think about holistic education, you always think about the extracurricular activities to fill in the palette so that the education also holds value. And nowadays, people or the students are quite keen in going abroad and studying further, going to Germany or going to Mexico. These places are attracting more students. So in that case, their local language is quite important. So I saw the website Urban Pro, which also gives you the connectivity between the tutor who is good in teaching German and the student who wants to learn German. In fact, my nephew is also planning to go to Germany next year. So he has already started learning German because that is basic bread and butter to be in a place. So that's something which Urban Pro is doing. I'm not sure what he's using, but definitely I saw that Urban Pro was also offering to connect the tutors. Yeah.
Yeah, talking of edutech, I don't know if you agree. Two names that come to my mind are NIIT and IGNOU, both of who started using technology very early, even before we started talking of data science. So is that something that's going to evolve more and more in coming years?
Yeah, I think, definitely, there is going to be more and more adoption of technology in every space, right? You have EdTech, you have FinTech, every space is going to have technology. But yeah, as I said, the inefficiencies today or in certain spaces, right? For example, let's say you want to do a program, right? You have to go to a place, you have to inquire at 4 or 5 different places, then you have to make a decision, you have to ask so many people, you have to visit the branch. This was what the case 10-15 years back. Today you do all the research online,
Right.
and in some cases you also enroll online,
Right.
So where is the inefficiency?
Right.
You probably take a course somewhere where you have to go every day, right? There is inefficiency, you waste a bit of time there. So to plug in this kind of inefficiency, they brought in this online training, right? Where you do it at your own convenience and things like that. I think that is where, the efficiency is coming in. So to add to that point, I got reminded of a point that Siddharth was talking about, where he mentioned about the drop rate, right? So this drop rate is a function of so many factors, right? So today, let us say if there is a program for 50,000, let's say there is a data science program of 50,000, there is a data science program for 1,000 rupees, right? So a person who is going to decide between these two programs will have a very different thought process, right? So to take up a 50,000 program, he'll think about so many things. Will I be in this place, right? Will this program be relevant to me in 6 months' time? Right? Is it worth investing so much money? Is there a way I can get this money back? Right? He'll think about so much of this. So let us say you get 100 leads for this. Somebody who's interested, you might be able to convert one person. But for a program worth 1,000, you won't think so much. Right? You will, out of 100 people, you might probably end up converting to 20, 25 people. So the efficiencies improve there. Somebody who never thought he will convert, I will anyway try taking this program, right? His mindset would have been, I will try taking this. If I feel it is good, I will continue. Otherwise, I will drop out. Such people will never join the larger program. So that is why I feel, the future is going to be like completely, this massive open online programs.
Yeah, probably also the dropout rate is maybe because the environment would not be motivating them or encouraging them to stay on. So that could be one of the reasons. I like the example that Vidya used about Tesla. Basically, she's talking about give what the market wants rather than what you have. It's a product market fit. So I would like to take this forward first with Ramakant and then probably Vidya can add on to it. In the past, we have had traditional companies like Hindustan Lever, Dabur, Parle-G, Amul. They're all power brands. They have survived generations and they still continue to rule the world. But they have had their own journey of getting into that product market fit that's been the success factor for them. But the newer companies like let's say Amazon or Airbnb or Apple or Spotify, Dropbox for example, they have all been blessed with the support of data that drives them to arrive at the product market fit probably much faster. So do you think the traditional method of trial and error is no longer relevant, or the number of iterations has come down but they still have to go through the trial and error even with the data support? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think there is absolute conformance among entrepreneurs on the trial and error, right? As to that's the only way. Rapid and cheaper trial and error is more relevant. So entrepreneurs don't look to, in fact, when I go and mentor startups, we tell them to experiment quicker, faster and fail or become bigger faster. So that's the only message we give. And so trial and error is the only way in which you can have a absolute market. There is not an absolute market fit. There is nothing like that, but the right market fit.
Right market fit.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's the only conformance.
So even with data science, you still have to go through the hall of trial and error.
Yes, absolutely. So as you were earlier mentioning, right, that the tangible parts of a brand and the intangible parts of a brand. So the tangible parts of the brand that, all of this will govern. So again, the data that you are looking after when you are doing this trial and error, that may not be the correct data also that you'll be looking at. As well as there'll be, we know of like 20 or 25 different types of biases at least when we look at that data. So all of this can, all of this ambiguity can be resolved only when you have more and more data, but of course more and more quicker and faster trials and failures. That in fact, rapid experimentation is the only way.
Right. Right. I read about how Airbnb had to go through several iterations before they actually got their product market fit right. So even with the support of data, I guess that's something that's unavoidable, right?
Yes, absolutely. So, Airbnb, a lot of the brands that are, especially the new age data brands, that base their entire business on the insights that they are able to draw out of data. So they also have to fail multiple times, and some of the brands that you just mentioned. So then they are no longer like NIIT, right? It was supposed, when we were kids, that was looked upon as the technology
Absolutely,
innovator.
true.
Right, and but they're no longer there.
They're no longer there.
They are no longer, and that is what the disruption, the industry 4.0 keeps doing it. And you have to re-innovate, you have to reinvent. And you
Yeah,
have to
keep harnessing it to the maximum possible to achieve the traction quickly. How does that work in the BFSI, Vidya?
While I understand that trial and error is definitely a good confirmation from the manufacturers, but it can't be the only way with banks. Once you lose the good clients, you will never get them back. It's very difficult to maintain the client base. I can take a manufacturing experience because one of my friends is part of the data analytics team in Hindustan Lever. Even the market products that they do the trial and error. Yes, it is definitely the base, like Ramakant said, that it is a age-old tried and tested method of bringing a product into life. Having said that, now they are doing it in much a better fashion because they have the market data and the flow of the data is real time. They have the work groups with which they work with to find out if this product is going to be hit in the market or not. And with the data collected with all these work groups, they can create the machine learning models which can immediately give you there are thousands of machine learning models which are developed by all these people who are sitting in a room, analyzing the entire world's data. But when it comes to the market trial, they are armed with the data already, so their hit rate is definitely higher. In BFSI, it can't be very loose. I can't take 1,000 models and go and attempt something. Though that's not possible at all. I have a client, and before even attempting to produce a new product or give a new service to the client, I have to be at least 80% sure that I am going in the right direction. For that, the existing data can help me. Like I mentioned earlier, I know my client's behavior patterns with his spends, with his loans, with his insurance products, with his investment products. I know everything about my client. So my model will basically give me the right product or the next right tip for the client to pick it up. So while it is, and now the artificial intelligence is also taking over. The artificial intelligence driven, the chatbots or the apps which are there with you, with the client in his arms, have to be enabled to give the right solutions. Otherwise, it will not be a good product. So basically, my model should work in such a way that I know the client, I need to be sure of the hit rate, only then I'll go and attempt. Otherwise, if I make a lot of mistakes, I know that fail fast is is something which our organization is also they propagate that, but the problem is you can't do the testing and trial and testing with the existing clients, or even the new. Once your goodwill is gone, you will not be able to gain that back. So there is a very thin line where you have to tread very slowly, but having said that, the data which is available gives me more confidence in approaching the base. So that is where the difference is. Earlier, it used to be only trial and error. Now it is more to do with, I am going to do this trial, but I want to test with my model whether it is going to be a good trial or not so good.
So the data analytics actually gives you insights into the potential value creation for a customer.
Absolutely. If it is going to create a market value proposition for my client, then I have to be sure that if it is, I can set my own limits, right? My threshold is 8. I can take 70% or 30% risk. I'm okay to take that. Or if I'm not ready, my clients are too valuable, or my clients are very high end, I can't do a trial and error with them, then I probably have to be 90% sure before even I approach this model. So that's the difference.
Something to this. So essentially, data gives you what the market is like, right? You can never very accurately predict what the product market fit will be like, right? So today, let's say, we figure out that, again, talk from the finance industry, right? You figure out that there is an underserved segment, people who have a salary less than 30,000. They are not served by banks for loans. Let's say they need credit, right? Nobody gives them loan. They have to depend on loan sharks, right? Now, there is a huge segment which is there. But let's say, we really cannot launch a product directly for them. to launch a product, we have to see whether your company, whether your organization has the ability to do the credit underwriting for them. Right? How do you, on what basis do you do underwriting for them? Let's say if these guys don't repay the loan, how do you collect? Do you have a team for that? Right? And so essentially the market is there. There's a market for this. There's a huge market for who requires loan. But can we build a product for them is a huge question. So we really cannot, we have to do a trial and error. We have to probably launch a product for a month or so. Then we will learn something from this, right? Who's repaying, who's not repaying. So it is an iterative process, right? So we will identify who's repaying, what kind of segments are not repaying. So how do we change the model in a way that, our system is better equipped to serve these customers?
It's totally based on the risk appetite of the bank. So if my risk is, I'm okay to give to Tom, Dick and Harry and wait for the loans to get converted or, final repayments, I'm still okay to have, if I have that kind of a risk appetite, I'll go for it. But again, before going or doing that, my model should be strong. If my machine learning model is correctly giving me the predictions, then probably I will approach, I can increase the risk appetite, saying that, okay, my model is saying 80% is sure, so probably I'll go and, hit those clients. But if the model itself is not very strong in itself, or the predictions are not very accurate, probably I don't want to take that risk to go to the new segment or, approach those clients. For even, we have seen this in the past, the PNB disaster and, the other disasters which happened in the BFSI segments, they are proofs for this, right? So based on the risk appetite that I am comfortable with, only then I will be able to approach. Now I have a solid backup of the machine learning models, which gives me the accuracy rate has been little higher than the earlier versions. So that gives me an advantage, and also the market conditions, I can input that as one of the inputs or one of the variables, so that I can include the political situations, I can put the NSE situation, I can add more variables which can make the model more accurate and more robust. That's something which we will be probably aiming for to satisfy my risk appetite.
So I think the 30,000, 20,000 segment is exactly the 2008 crisis which happened, subprime lending. So people who are not actually eligible based on their scores, but still we go and lend to them. And the risk appetite, obviously it depends on the risk appetite of the institution, right? So Ramakant, again, I think your example of think fast and fail fast, we had a good discussion on that, rather scale fast or fail fast, right? Now, a typical example, since you spoke about this concept of scale fast or fail fast, I remember in the early days in Bangalore, we used to use Taxi for Sure, even before Ola was really very prominent, right? And the failure of Taxi for Sure was always given that, Ola came with the deep pockets and they had no option because they got into an aggressive price war. And finally, they brought Taxi for Sure to the discussion table and they bought them off. So that is what happened at that stage because of deep pockets. In most of the cases, I think in startup space, it happens that the startups fail either because they burn out due to shortage of cash, or a bigger rival comes and get into a price war by investing a lot of money in the market. So Taxi for Sure came and Ola came, acquired them, that happened. Now we have got a comparison between equals. We have got Ola, which is trying to drive Food Panda, and we have got Swiggy and Zomato, all almost on an equal platform. Now Food Panda could not really pick up that well, and Swiggy became the market leader eventually. So how do we ascertain the causes of this failure? Pockets are equally deep, money is there on the table, and product knowledge or technology is already available. So what could be the reason behind this failure?
I have a slightly different perspective. I don't say this is a failure. I believe that, there are market forces at play right now. And when I say market forces, we have seen the likes of Swiggy, Foodpanda and all. So, of course, everybody is coming with a deep pocket of VC funding. And then there is this regulatory aspect also that is coming in. As to that, you could not discount your service or a product preferentially, right? But then this is what we are witnessing right now, and that is a lot more market forces at play, in which in this industry specifically, one phenomena has stood out is the winner takes it all, right? As you said, the taxi for sure and all that get consumed in Ola kind of businesses. So the winner will take it all. That has been a tested hypothesis. That has been a hypothesis which has stood out for like last 20 years now. With Swiggy and Foodpanda, Zomato fighting it out, they are fighting it for a different market segment completely, right? Of being the largest and the biggest aggregator. At the same time, we have other differentiated offerings in the food market itself coming out and doing fairly well. We have Cult, which is doing fairly well in its own targeted segment. We have other home food producers which are doing fairly well. We have these ready-to-eat packaged foods. I know of so many brands which are also doing fairly well and growing very nicely. So I don't believe there's a failure, honestly said, but what I believe is, of course, in that large aggregated market, who has made it the real big, I think we'll have to allow it to unfold in the coming years. My reading is that. Yeah.
Okay. I think, I have a couple of points on this. So one is I completely agree with what Ramakant is saying. Basically, there is not enough space for so many players in the market, in the food industry. Basically, I think top 1 or 2 players can survive in the long term. That is one. Second is, even when when Ola acquired Foodpanda, they were a distant third. So they were not, they didn't really start at the same place, right? I was not sure why they acquired them in the first place, right? So maybe I think, when Uber was going to come out with Uber Eats, they thought, we should also have a product like that. It was unrelated. I don't know. To me, it feels like unrelated diversification. So that is there. And so that's what I feel. When there are 3 players, there is not enough space for three players. And they did not even, these guys already had a first mover advantage. Swiggy, they had a much better market share when Ola acquired Foodpanda itself. So it is very difficult to go and grab the market share from 2 of the very established players right now. And of course, Swiggy was always a better product by itself. Swiggy was always a better product. But I don't really think the product alone contributed so much to, what...
I think they're just fighting on operational excellence rather than innovation. There is no innovation again. Everybody's trying to do the same thing.
Exactly. And obviously, in terms of Swiggy, so there are 2 things to product side, right? One is the app itself. So if you see most startups today, they have 2 product managers. One is somebody who's the technology product, somebody who manages the, the offering. Right? These are 2 separate products. Let's say in Swiggy, what kind of restaurants you have, what is the pricing you have, this is a product itself, right? And what kind of tech solution do you have, right? Which is the user-facing app or a website that you have. And that was really good at Swiggy. I think probably Zomato did not have such a good product initially. I think now they have come really close to what Swiggy is offering. But in this case, when I compare Foodpanda with Swiggy, I don't really think it was due to the product itself, but I think it was because of, they were already a distant third player when they got acquired.
Swiggy,
A name that people can get hooked to. Maybe they also have a name that people can get hooked to very easily. Emotional connect.
If you are an investor, let's say in Swiggy, right? If you are an investor, let's say in Swiggy, or if I am driving Swiggy business, you have to see to grow this. So they are playing the numbers. So these brands are playing the numbers game. So numbers come from 2 factors. One is customer, and the second is the service provider. So to get a service provider, that is a restaurant. So how faster or how easily, let's say, that's where data comes in. So I was talking to, I was talking to a technology evangelist who kind of advises Swiggy's board. So the biggest challenge that they have to expand not only in countryside India, but to also expand their operations globally, is how could they create scalable image analytics, which will add just a camera button, unravel the menu options in any restaurant cards with just one image, any language, any format, and it should pull the menu out from that cart into their app. If you see, that's the only biggest technology innovation that probably, if I am Swiggy, I'll just focus on that. Because my sales guys then can just, or hire to people can just go around in a drive, just take pictures and then the onboarding of the service provider is as easy as possible, right? And here we are talking of diversity globally, right? There are different languages. Languages read from right to left, left to right. There are different menu items. There are different ways in which people eat. We typically veg. Then we have Israelis who want to eat in a different way. So all of this, all of that information is coming into the menu of a restaurant, and that should be and the reading of the restaurant menu should be automatic, single click.
User experience.
Yeah. So I mean that's what technology
Should do.
And, yeah, that's the perk.
Although they came with deep pockets, I really think that the market that has grown from 2014 till 2019, the growth rate of the customer base is enormous with Swiggy. Zomato, although it brought in the Zomato Gold, which I was a member last year, but I hardly used, because it did not target the right people at the right time. Probably they were trying to create an elite class within the Zomato users. But what Swiggy did best was to concentrate on the millennials and the people who are staying away from home. So for example, in Bangalore and in my office itself, the entire floor, if we are 200 people in the entire floor, at least 180 of them are not from Bangalore. They don't stay with their families. They are all staying here on probably a contractual basis for 1 or 2 years. They did not want to shift the family. They are in requirement of, say, Bihari food or Punjabi food. So those millennials are okay to spend that amount rather than, go to a restaurant, and you know how the Bangalore traffic is and how the restaurants get crowded at the peak time. So all these factors, they concentrated specifically on the ad campaigns which hit the millennials best. And we know that, the more usage of the smartphone is done by the millennials today, right? And the more matured crowd have at least 2 mobile phones which contribute to the smartphone usage. So all these were the factors where, although they came with the deep pockets, like I mentioned earlier, the concentration of their ad campaigns were towards the millennial crowd, which was more eager to try out new things and to pick up the trend, because, if you ask my daughter, she'll say, let's Swiggy it. It's kind of a catchphrase which is picking up, and people want to experiment more on the ones which are in the trend. And you know how many of those are coming into the Instagram and Twitter, and these are the things where it's motivating people to pick up all these new trends. But I think Swiggy concentrated on that and got its base higher. Because it started, if I'm not wrong, the last that I read about Swiggy is in 2014, it had some 2 billion base around the world, and now it is 20 billion. You can imagine the rate growth here year on year, and it's definitely going to go above. But again, there is a stagnation point which they have to concentrate on, which they will move on to, being more product innovators rather than doing everything that, everybody is doing. So that's probably they should be concentrating on.
I just have a topic about what stops people from becoming data-driven enterprises. So I'm sure, like any transformation, data science also has its own set of challenges. If I take education as an example to start with, there are so many things that, education as an ecosystem has access to abundance of data, right? It's an organic access. There's so many things that you can do in terms of enrollments analysis or faculty development or curriculum design or the training methodologies. But I'm sure there's a lot of potential still untapped in the education space, and rightly you are mentioning that it's still in the nascent stage. So what do you think are the challenges that are stopping them from leveraging on it? Is it the culture, or is it the cost, or is it the encouragement from the management to take on risks and reward them adequately for innovations?
See, I think today I don't think in any of the startups, right, you cannot really say that, you won't be driven by data. You cannot even say that. right? And there is so much emphasis on data today. So even if you are not using data, you have to say that you are using data. So that is how it is. So I think the challenges are data is pretty much isolated. Let's say as there are a lot of startups today. If you have to start if you have to start up something on your own, initially you don't have any data to start with. You are probably depending on public data, publicly available data, which may or may not be right. Right? You might probably do something based on what is available in public domain, and it might quite turn out to be completely false. Right? That can happen. So you don't start with this data. Let's say once you're, then there are so many startups around, in the same industry. Each of them have their own data. They will not share it with others. So in the finance space, there is a particular NBFC. What they have done is they have tied up with 3-4 banks. Right? The objective of this tie-up is only to get the data from these banks. Right? So they get the banking information about all the users, and based on that they will give loans. So the biggest thing in the fintech space today is, in the lending space today is, how do I devise an alternative credit mechanism? See, historically banks have been giving loans based on CIBIL score, bureau scores, right? There are multiple bureaus today. CIBIL is there, Equifax is there, are 3-4 bureaus in India right now, and all that these guys do is they get data from all the banks, what kind of, how much EMI does he have, right? Is he paying properly? Has he defaulted on any EMI, right? These are the kind of information they get. So based on that, everybody has a CIBIL score. If you have a CIBIL score of 750, 800 or something, it's really good. Typically somebody who has a CIBIL score of 650 or something, they will not even get a loan from most of the nationalized banks. So that is why most of the NBFCs today are really focusing on how do we devise an alternative credit mechanism, right? How can I give a loan to somebody who has a credit score of 650, right? Somebody who has a credit score of 650 basically means he has defaulted on some loan. Now this is a market which will not get loan from bank. So for this guy, I can charge a higher interest because he will not get loan from anywhere else, right? But how do I identify whether this guy will pay my money back or not? So this is one situation. Second is, somebody who has never taken a loan in the past. How do you, so typically, bureaus, they will not give you any result in that. So how do you predict whether he will, pay the money back or not, right? So here exactly, so that's why a lot of companies are into, are finding out ways on how to generate data today. Yeah, so there are companies who, see, for example, there are apps today, what they can, I don't know, some of you might even have these apps on your mobile phones, right? What these apps do is, they can actually they can replicate your bank statement, even without you knowing. So what they do is they simply read your SMSs, right? And they can say how much you have spent, what is your salary, right? They can share all this information. In fact, there is a startup which actually is, what they have done is they have tied up with a lot of apps. For example, there are mass apps, for example, religion-related apps and all that. What they have done is they have put their SDK into all their apps. So they can track so many users. So you enter your mobile number, you might probably have a credit score with them. You probably don't even know that somebody is tracking you. So these are alternative ways of where startups are really using to in fact startups today are desperate to get data. So I don't really think startups can really afford to be away from data. In fact, from whatever I've seen, most startups are desperate for data.
Linus, you spoke about more about the credit appraisal part and the banks or NBFCs having the appetite to lend to these segments.
Yeah.
But even today, despite we having so many conveniences, we can make a payment quickly using UPI apps, any Google Pay or Phone Pay. You can transfer money, receive money, we can do everything. We can open an account sitting at home. Kotak, you can just open a 811 account, say within 2-3 minutes, upload your documents. But if you have to change your address, you still have to go to the branch. That bureaucracy, when is it going to end, is a question which I actually wanted to ask Vidya and the panel. So do we see some innovation there?
It's already there, Sid. So
Many banks don't still
many
do it.
banks don't do it. There were some regulatory issues around it. That's the reason why it was not. But it has been relaxed. And 2 years back, Citibank has taken this up. And the entire account address change process is online. Because now we have an option of uploading the document, because you can take a picture and upload it. and in the specific dimensions that that is specified in the website, and you can still get your address change done. This was done very recently, as in 2 years, in the last 2 years. Earlier, it used to be a regulation issue from the RBI side rather than the bank side. Bank is not conservative. Banks want to be as relaxed as possible or make clients' life easier. But the problem is coming from the super boss who is sitting in the, the middle of the India and, trying to drive something from there. So now that it has been relaxed, I think more branches or more banks should pick this up and try to, implement this in their own websites as well. Because all you do is in a secured environment. When you give that security to the clients and also the confidence to RBI saying that you are able to protect your clients' data, including the document which is not of bank but passport is related to the passport office. Your driving license is the RTO and Aadhaar card is the UIDAB. So all these are in a protected environment. Definitely there will be more confidence at the client's end and also the RBI's end. That's the reason why Citibank has already relaxed it, and you can...
In fact, the cost overheads will come down. There is no branch required at all. You don't have to have a branch in every neighborhood.
Absolutely. Recently in SCB we have opened African branch, which is completely a smart branch, which it's like borderless branches. So you don't need to, all you need is a smartphone, and you can still open an account and interact with other banks. You can transfer money, you can use other partner ATMs to deposit your money, and all these are possible. A lot of foreign banks have already tried it. In India it's still catching up, but definitely it's on the way.
Great. I experienced Paytm. See, they do their KYC verification at the doorstep, whereas the banks want you to go to the bank and show your Aadhaar card and get your KYC compliance done. So why do we even require a branch? You just send a person, you don't require a branch at all. It saves you a lot of money. Do the verification wherever the client wants.
While I respect your feeling, there are still a lot of people, at least the people who are old-timer bankers, they still feel that, if I go to the branch, I feel more respected.
Okay.
I feel more connected with the bank. I want to, I have to actually have the brick and mortar touch and feel experience. There are so many retired people who want to go to the branch to spend some time with their relationship manager to build more, or probably these people are the source for the next client base inclusion, because their sons and daughters and their grandsons and grandkids, they talk about everything, and we can even find methods of bringing in more business to the bank. So we also encourage it, and the people who require that, definitely they are also valued. They feel more valued when they are brought in, they are seated in a couch, offered something, and talk about their family, and still talk about their requirements. Definitely people want that. Some of them, yeah.
So there is a segment which still allows to come to the branch.
Absolutely. It's a live example is my dad. He likes to go to his, he used to work for Bank of India earlier, and even today, once in a month, he goes to the bank to at least make that feel that, he still belongs to that community, and also, he's a valued customer there. So that happens with a few of the generations, but people like, the millennials or people like us, we probably don't have the time and energy to go to the bank. Probably that's one of the reasons why we, resort to digital modes. And our PM Modi also suggests that, all the banks should go digitized, and we need to have less branches. It makes sense, but it's more practical, pragmatic, but definitely there is a segment of people who love the other side of it.
Actually, what you are saying is true also of the millennials and the younger generations, because once in a while, making that personal connect can hugely impact the relationship. So probably they don't do it as often as the elders do it, but once in a way, I think it makes a huge difference in the relationship
because
management.
Once you are in the branch, probably you'll get to know more things about what the bank does and how the vaults work, how the crowds are managed, because everything is technology driven today. So when you walk into a branch, you will know what is the pain that these people are going through. Probably that will also be a source to go digital at some point.
True, absolutely. Yeah. So Ramakant, you have any points to share on what stops people from becoming data-driven enterprises, if there are any?
No, so it's. I'll just add one point to this.
Oh, sure.
So the direction in which India is leading, I'm not sure. So recently, I think last month, one of the initiatives of the government that was unveiled Yeah, so one of the recent initiatives, especially in income tax department, it was how do you remove the person from the transaction, right? So that is the actual, so that's the power of data, right? So the basis in which you take a decision, earlier days when there was either no data collection or the data collection was minuscule, interactions and all of that used to count towards making, okay, whether this guy is reliable or not, whether this guy will buy my product or not. So all of that has got replaced with data, and it had its own share of abuses, right? The conversations, the ambiguity in the discussions, it had its own share of malice, and I mean, there are benefactors and there are abusers, both of it. So with data coming in, you have removed the person. I walk into anywhere and any place. I have a, let's say if I travel today, just if I check in into if I check in into a Hilton, I mean they exactly keep what I need in the morning, right? They will keep in the same place, and if I land in an airport, they will have the right person coming in and things like that. So that's the power of data. You have removed the person. You are talking to the features of the product. So coming to your first question, Asha, so one of the key goals of Government of India and NASSCOM is we are looking to have as much of adoption. So we see this more as a culture, right? And in fact it is so. So nobody can say that bringing in more data and taking decisions by data is not good. I don't think anybody in the room or elsewhere will say that. It's more of a culture. It's like years of behavior is going to change. So this is more of a culture question. Sure. So what we essentially do is we highlight. So one of the key ways in which we do is of doing this is we understand when we talk to leaders in the industry, be it pharma, be it banks, be it retail, be it agriculture, defense. So we talk to a variety of stakeholders at NASSCOM, right? So we talk to the defense, I mean, we had recently people from HAL, DRDO coming in, ISRO coming in, and we understood the problem statements and we connected startups to them to solve some of them. And it's not that, so key is to highlight the success stories.
Yeah.
So that mitigates, and a journey of a data-driven creation of a journey of a data-driven product essentially a product, when I define product, it's a combination of features, right, or that a product promises to deliver. So if I highlight the success stories or a journey that it has taken to reach there, I think it brings in it risk mitigation strategies, it brings in it the best practices. Right. So it's more of a culture change or staged program management of adoption. Right. That's how we say it, and one of our key initiatives we are working towards is that. Yeah. I mean,
so creating awareness of the benefits that data science can bring to organizations.
Yes, more often than not, when we speak to decision makers, or when we sit in board discussions, we tend to say that okay, implementing new age technology doesn't give you ROI. More often than not, but the right people are not making that comment, right? So people, that is one, and also the project selection. So I shouldn't see that as earlier you made a comment, right? You are seen as a magic wand. Right. No, it is not.
Right.
I don't see data. I mean, if I'm a CEO today and if I want that with data coming in, I can solve all my problems. No, it is just replace. It's just decision economics.
Right.
That has to work.
Interesting.
There's one small element missing in the entire conversation about this particular question is the people who are working on the ground. The data, while you talk about the companies who want to be data driven, there are plenty, almost like he said, even if they are not working with data, they'll still say that they are working because it's a social, it has become a social status now. But when it comes to the people on the ground, when you go to them, give them that, I'm creating a data driven culture, it's not widely accepted. They don't want to go by that way because they are all okay to do with what they were doing earlier. The same old methods of doing, and I have personally seen is in my organizations, wherever I've worked in the past, people don't want to change. change is very, very bad. You know, they don't want to, you know, they are so insecure, they are so much into their comfort zone. Even if you ask them to, you know, start taking that seed and this seed, they will have hesitation, why should I do it? Same goes for the data. Like he rightly mentioned, the data-driven culture has to start from the top down, but it has to be so inclusive that the people on the ground should be valued. Because they see that data, new technology, a machine learning model, you know, artificial intelligence, all these are threatening factors to their job. Everybody is working there because they want their job. Nobody wants to be out of job. So exactly the point where they think that, you know, all these data driven or, you know, the changes in the company, the decision makers are making so many changes, asking us to do so many different things. They always have that insecurity in them that, you know, when will my job be off? Because the media hype about, you know, job cuts because of, you know, robots taking their jobs is like really crazy. It's not so.
Very valid point. Yeah.
If you have 10 steps in your process and 2 of them can be automated so that you can use that intellectual memory or intellectual capacity that the humans only can have to other 8 processes is not something is very, you know, widely propagandaed, because people think that, okay, AI is coming, there is a chatbot which is going to be there, so probably my call center will be going off. That's not the case. That is definitely not the case. In fact, there is a audio book which I was listening to, Harvard Business Review, Thomas E. Davenport. He had rightly mentioned that this is a thing, even if I know how to drive the car, I can tell, you know, even if I want to write down all the steps, there are something which I still know, which I can't put it in pen and paper. And machines require that. Only with you put it in pen and paper and ask them to learn from that, they will be able to do it. If I have millions of pictures of horse and label them as horse, only then the model is able to give me that, you know, when a new picture is coming, I can, you know, the model can tell me whether it is a horse or not. But there are certain things which I still know deep down in my brain which is not convertible. There is a paradigm there, because people think that, you know, machines can learn for their own. No, it's not. And all these form the bottom line is people think that, you know, once the machine comes into picture, we will be out of jobs. So this change management is more the resistance that they see, and whenever there is a mass resistance, the decision makers are also, you know, little backfooting, saying that should I even go for this? Is it even worth, you know, disappointing so many people and, you know, getting into something major? Because it's time and energy, I'm going to invest a lot. Are my people going to adopt it? So that's another point which is, you know, change management is definitely a point which
Right.
decision makers should
Right.
consider.
And you rightly mentioned that it has to be a top-down approach, so the top management have to be futuristic in their vision and send across the right messages down the line to
Absolutely.
make sure that they embrace it.
Yes.
And also give them the freedom to take on risks and encourage them when things work out right.
Rather than
Support them.
Yeah, rather than telling those people, saying that this requires a very specific
Right.
skill,
Right.
and you don't have it, so go out of the job.
Right.
The management should encourage them to upskill them and then bring them
True.
up to the point where they can use the technology wisely. So that is something which is missing in few organizations. Few bigger organizations are taking special care of this L&D, learning and development of this of the ground level staff, and letting them explore more. People who
Right.
are interested in learning
Right.
more, they are encouraging them.
Right, very well said. Shall we open it up for question and answers? Feel free to ask questions. You have an expert panel here.
What are the challenges faced by the students in the industrial world once they are done with their education?
Who is the question for?
So I think a lot of people have, we do hire a bit of, we have hired freshers in the past as well. So one does, it takes a bit of time for them to ramp up. They don't have a lot of industry knowledge, they don't have domain knowledge. So I think it is probably a good idea to have, to come up, to do some kind of projects before you even get onto your first job. That will probably give you, you will probably hit the ground running when you start an organization. That is something we find with freshers. It takes at least good 3-4 months for them to come up to speed with, the organization policies, the practices, how things work, how things don't work, right? How to interact with others, including things like that. See, in a university setup, you might probably be able to get the first rank even without interacting with anybody else. But in an organization, you cannot succeed unless you are able to work with others, right? So these are multiple skills, right? Soft skills, everything is in product. I'm not talking about only one, how good are you at finance, how good are you at marketing. That alone does not matter, right? Interpersonal skills, all of these matter. So, I don't know how your curriculum is, but if your curriculum has all these things covered, then probably you'll have a easy entry process into the corporate setup.
Yeah, just for the benefit of the students, maybe I would like to add a couple of lines. What happens is what you learn in your theoretical education system is one step behind what you actually apply when you take on jobs. So applying what you have learned is going to be one of the biggest challenges that you will face. Two, culture management. It's a new environment. It's like Linus was mentioning, you need to be very good at managing people, people above you, your peers, people down the line. So all of these are going to pose big challenges. And the third, of course, is managing the professional expectations of your employers. So all of these three require some kind of a corporate culture that you can actually try and experience even while you are at the campus. A lot of organizations are doing this. They're trying to bridge the industry-academia gap by organizing workshops, industrial visits, and organizing panel discussions such as this. So they give you insights into what you can expect when you actually take on a job. So that's something that you can start to orient yourself in the direction even when you are in your final year. So when you actually take on a job, you won't have surprises.
It just reminds me of this Google song. I don't know how many of you, it was viral some time back, don't look into Google when you want to know about a symptom. Because Google gives you, it was quite funny. You should probably look it up in YouTube. There's a foreigner who was singing with his guitar on. So basically, a lot of the millennials or people who are in colleges, they have very high hopes when they enter into the corporates because Google gives you a lot of hype. So all I'm asking you to do is have an open mind. Okay, because when you start off, it is going to be difficult. Understand that it is going to be difficult for you, for the people who are hiring you, for the people who are going to accept you in their team. Being a team player is definitely a good trait which people should have, but they have to have open mind to embrace the culture, embrace the activities which are happening around you. Give it some time. You don't have to decide everything on the first day or the first month or even the first year. When you get used to certain things, you will slowly step out of your comfort zone and probably be more aligned with the organization's goals and culture and people around you. Because there are different organizations have different cultures. We very well know that Google allows half pants, but not every bank does that. Banks, again, when it is a client-facing role, probably you have to be completely decked up. When you are in the ITO segment, probably you can walk in with your jeans and flip-flops. So there are a lot of changes. You have to have an open mind to accommodate yourself to the environment that you are stepping into. While the managers and the organizations also give a lot of time, lot of help from their side, training you, promoting you to accept all these things. I think when you go in with an open mind, it will definitely give you a faster accommodating tendency rather than being rigid and you have a mindset, oh, I didn't think this would be this case. So those are the things that you can avoid when you have an open mind.
How many of you want to be entrepreneurs? Okay. So we should have more hands in this category if you want to be world leaders in product lead. Yeah.
That's the shortcut to becoming a CEO.
No, the key is we have the demographic dividend working for country right now. So the key is to build not only products for India but for the world out of India. So that's the goal, and yeah, so happy to mentor or any student who wants to create world-class products. Be happy. In fact, we are spending a lot of time and energy in inculcating that and bringing out entrepreneurs, create world-class products. I mean, this year I think we had 13 unicorns, right, coming out of India, and after 5 years we want to see 100 unicorns coming out of the country every year. So
An opportunity to grab.
yeah, as youngsters, I think that is the opportunity you should look at. If don't get into a job, it'll put in all the biases. Be independent, be strong, and build products which actually solve a problem. So that's very important for you guys. Very early in your career, you have the liberty to take as much risks as you can quite early, which you will not find, which you will not be able to do, let's say 10 years after, right?
My question is, how do students like us prepare ourselves for a data-driven world, or train ourselves for a data-driven world? Huh? Like, how do students like us prepare ourselves or train ourselves for a data-driven world?
So, do you code?
It's a question from my side.
Sorry?
It's a question from my side, like your opinions or suggestions.
Yeah,
for
what
us.
I'm asking is, do you code?
Are you a coder?
Yes, kind of, yes.
Kind of. So code as many Hello World applications, integrating as much sources of data as you can. Right? You open up any application, open up Facebook, it gives you a list of APIs. Create a Hello World and integrate to all the APIs. You will know what it takes. So don't, in short, the answer is, don't, to become data driven, don't do it theoretically, do it practically.
So just to add to what Ramakant had said, what I would suggest is that technology and all these analytical driven tools and technologies, whatever is coming in the system, everything has a base of C, C++, but it keeps evolving. So if you know SQL, probably it's easier for you to do SAS, and probably it's easier for you to learn R and Python, which was my career journey. So when you know something base, which your schools and colleges will provide, you have to be very strong in that. When you are strong in that, like how you mentioned, you have to be more practical about it. These are theoretical, and also the projects that you do are also kind of theoretical. But when it actually comes to the project part, when you are open in the internet market, where sites like Kaggle and Analytics Vidya, which gives you an opportunity to showcase your expertise, please do attempt those. That will probably be helpful for you to start off somewhere. To be data driven, it's completely a different matter altogether, because that is helping you to make decisions. To make the decisions, you need data. You definitely, not necessarily know how to code. I can be a decision maker. I can take somebody's help and make the data work for me, give me the insights. So being data driven is that you have to love it. That's the only criteria. But when you start off somewhere, you probably have to be cleaning the data and giving more, presentable format in the visualization tools. Probably you can learn those tools which are up and coming, and probably that will give you a start point.
Ma'am, my question is for you. You told that you can't do the trial and error method on the clients whom you have. Then whom will you do the trial and error method on?
Okay, probably I did not come off clearly. What I mentioned was, what Asha was talking about is that have you heard about this Power Soap? Yeah, Power Soap. It used to be the cheapest, and it was trying to bring in good marketing advertisements coming and hitting the market. See, when I don't have you as my dedicated client, I can try anything on you. Okay, I can give you power soap, I can give you, rubber soap also tomorrow. Nobody will bother. Because you either take it or you don't take it. If you take it, I am okay. If you're not taking it, probably I'll move it to another product. But when it happens to the dedicated client line who trust us to give the right products to them, it is difficult to do a trial and error with them. So probably I will have to take my steps. I'll still do trial and error, but I will be backed up with the data which gives me more competence to approach the client more confidently, saying that we know this is your career stage. Probably, say for example, I have an insurance product which I have to sell it to the client. I can't just take all my insurance products and put it in front of him saying that pick whatever you want. Then he will say, what are you doing here? Just offering me these. Can't you do the digging from your side to find out which is the right for me? I think relationship manager is built for that, right? So this is the question we are trying to answer. If I know that these clients are in such a stage of their career and such a stage of their age, they probably will pick up the plan which is more into their retirement plan, which is more convenient for them, which is going to have some tax benefits, and also retirement planning is done. So some kind of tailoring that I can do and produce that product and give it to you, that may not be a trial and error, because I'm going to approach only 20 clients, and my model says probably 18 of them will say yes to it. Okay, so that is probably what I wanted to put forward, that you should still have to do it, but you have to do cautiously. If I say that you keep coming to my shop, buying something, one day I give you a very bad food and you will never turn up to my place, obviously you are a loss to me, right? So rather than that, I would probably do a more, understand if you like spicy food or not, and then give you spicy food. That makes more sense, right? That's the difference.
So I hope you have all enjoyed this session. Glad to hear that. So you all know that data science is a great potential career opportunity for all of you. Very good. I would like to thank the panelists for sharing their valuable insights on this topic. I'm sure it's benefited a lot of people. Thanks for coming over. On behalf of TBS and SID, I would like to say thanks to all of you once again.
Pleasure is mine.
Hope you all enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely.
That was a very informative and interesting decision. Thank you so much. On behalf of Mr. Sid, Ms. Asha, the management of Danan Sagar Business Academy, and fellow students, I thank the panelists for taking time off on a Saturday afternoon to discuss about this very important subject. The discussion was very relevant for budding graduates and postgraduates who will, in a few months from now, enter the corporate maze and take a diverse role. I also thank Ms. Asha and Mr. Sid for hosting this at our campus, thus immensely benefiting us. Thank you so much.